In the waning days of the 19th century, as America stood on the precipice of a new era, there existed a family in the small coastal town of Blackmere, Massachusetts. The Caldwell family, respected and prosperous, harbored a secret that would challenge the very notion of fate and free will. This is the account of their extraordinary burden, the ability to witness events yet to come, coupled with the cruel impossibility of altering them. The town of Blackmere sits nestled between the rocky coastline and dense pine forests of northern Massachusetts. Its economy thrived on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade with Boston and beyond. Gas lamps illuminated the cobblestone streets at night, while the more affluent homes had begun to adopt the marvel of electric lighting. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along the roads, and the occasional automobile, still a rare sight, would cause children to run alongside in wonderment. The Caldwell residence stood on Harborview Hill, overlooking both the town and the turbulent Atlantic. The house, a stately Victorian mansion with ornate gables and a widow's walk, had been in the family for 3 generations. Inside lived Elias Caldwell, a shipyard owner and respected businessman, his wife Margaret, known for her charity work, their children, Thomas 19, Elizabeth 17, and young William 10, and Margaret's mother, Agatha Winters, a stern woman of 72 years. Our story begins on September 12, 1899, when the first autumn chill had begun to settle over Massachusetts. The Caldwell family gathered in their dining room for supper, the dark mahogany table set with fine china and silver candlesticks, casting a warm glow over their faces. The conversation flowed as it typically did. Thomas spoke of his studies at Harvard, Elizabeth discussed the upcoming harvest festival, and young William recounted his adventures along the shore. Then, without warning, Grandmother Agatha's teacup crashed to the floor. Her eyes, normally a piercing blue, had gone entirely white. She gripped the table's edge with such force that her knuckles turned pale as bone. The family froze, familiar with what was happening, yet never entirely prepared for it. "The Lambert boy," Agatha whispered, her voice unnaturally deep. "Tomorrow at midday. The quarry, the loose stone. His mother's cries will echo for days." Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Agatha blinked rapidly, her eyes returning to their normal state. She looked confused momentarily before noticing the broken cup at her feet. "Oh dear," she murmured, reaching for her napkin. "I've made a mess again." Elias and Margaret exchanged knowing glances. Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Elizabeth placed a comforting hand on her grandmother's arm. Only young William seemed unperturbed, continuing to eat his potatoes as if nothing unusual had occurred. "I'll speak with Henry Lambert in the morning," Elias said quietly to his wife, "though I suspect it will do little good." Margaret nodded solemnly. "We must try nonetheless." This was the Caldwell family curse, or gift, depending on one's perspective. For 7 generations, the ability to glimpse the future had manifested in at least one family member per generation. Agatha had inherited it from her father, and young William had recently begun showing signs of the same capability. The visions came without warning, revealing events ranging from the mundane to the catastrophic. Yet despite countless attempts across the decades, no Caldwell had ever succeeded in altering what they had foreseen. The following morning, Elias Caldwell dressed in his finest suit and hat, then walked the mile to the Lambert residence on the edge of town. Henry Lambert, a quarryman with a reputation for stubbornness, listened skeptically as Elias advised him to keep his son Timothy away from the quarry that day. "With all due respect, Mr. Caldwell," Lambert said, standing in his doorway with arms crossed, "I can't afford to lose a day's wages because your mother-in-law had a bad dream. Timothy knows his way around the quarry. Been working alongside me since he was 12. "I understand your position," Elias replied, maintaining his composure despite the man's dismissive tone. "Perhaps I could compensate you for the day's wages? Consider it a favor to an old friend." Lambert's expression hardened. "We're not friends, Caldwell. You're the man who owns half the town, and I'm the man who breaks his back to feed his family. I don't need your charity or your superstitions." The door closed firmly in Elias's face. He stood there momentarily, the weight of foreknowledge heavy on his shoulders, before turning back toward home. In his pocket was a gold watch, a family heirloom he had brought along, intending to offer it as compensation or bribe if necessary. Now it seemed as useless as his warning. At precisely 12 minutes past noon, Timothy Lambert, aged 16, was crushed beneath a half-ton of granite that broke unexpectedly from the quarry wall. His death was instantaneous. though his mother's wailing, as Agatha had predicted, continued for days afterward. This tragedy was but one of countless futures the Caldwells had foreseen yet failed to prevent. Over dinner that evening, a somber affair punctuated by long silences, Thomas finally voiced what many in the family had contemplated throughout the years. "Perhaps we're not meant to change the future," he suggested, his Harvard education evident in his measured philosophical tone. "Perhaps we're merely witnesses to the inevitable." "But why?" Elizabeth demanded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What purpose does it serve to know what's coming if we can do nothing to stop it? It's a cruel joke." Elias cleared his throat. "We've had this discussion many times, children. Your great-grandfather wrote extensively about his attempts to change what he saw. He once foresaw a fire that would destroy half of Boston. He warned everyone he could, yet when the day came, the fire still raged. The only difference was that he was labeled a madman for his efforts. The burden of foreknowledge without the power to intervene," Margaret added softly. "It's our family's cross to bear." Young William, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "I saw something too," he said, his voice small yet steady. "Last night in my dreams." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to the boy. William had shown signs of inheriting the ability, occasional correct predictions about weather or visitors, but nothing significant until now. "What did you see, William?" his mother asked gently. "A man with a strange machine," William replied, sketching in the air with his fingers. "It flies through the sky like a bird, but it's made of metal. He crashes into the bell tower on Christmas Eve." Margaret and Elias exchanged concerned glances. William's description sounded fantastical, more like something from one of Mr. Wells's science fiction novels than a genuine premonition, yet they knew better than to dismiss it outright. "That's months away," Thomas reasoned, "and what you're describing, it sounds impossible." "Perhaps it's symbolic," suggested Elizabeth, who had recently developed an interest in the interpretation of dreams. "The flying machine could represent something else entirely." Agatha, who had remained silent throughout dinner, finally spoke. "The boy sees true," she stated firmly, "just as I did at his age, just as my father did before me. The visions don't always make sense in the moment, but they always come to pass." The conversation shifted to other matters, but William's prediction lingered in their minds. It was added to the family ledger, a leather-bound book in which they recorded all significant visions, their attempts to intervene, and the inevitable outcomes. The ledger, now in its third volume, served as both historical record and cautionary tale for future generations of Caldwells. As September gave way to October, life in Blackmere continued its regular rhythms. The fishing boats went out at dawn and returned laden with cod and mackerel. The shipyard that bore the Caldwell name completed a schooner commissioned by a merchant from Boston. The town prepared for the coming winter, storing preserves and stacking firewood. For the Caldwell family, however, these weeks brought a troubling development. William's visions increased in both frequency and clarity. He would often wake screaming in the night, his small body drenched in sweat, his mind filled with images of events yet to come. Some were trivial. Mrs. Peterson's prize hen would escape, or the schoolteacher would contract influenza, while others foretold more significant occurrences, like the capsizing of the fishing vessel Merry Widow, which would claim the lives of 4 local men. As with all their premonitions, the family made discreet attempts to prevent these tragedies. Elias spoke with the captain of the Merry Widow, suggesting he delay his voyage due to potential poor weather. Margaret called upon Mrs. Peterson, ostensibly for tea, and casually mentioned that her chicken coop appeared to have a loose board. Elizabeth left an anonymous note for the school teacher, advising her to strengthen her constitution with herbal tonics. Yet the hen escaped nonetheless. The teacher fell ill, and on October 17th, the Merry Widow capsized in suddenly violent seas, leaving 4 wives widowed and 16 children fatherless. After each failure, William grew more withdrawn. The burden of seeing misfortune without the power to prevent it weighed heavily on his young shoulders. His mother found him one evening in the library, poring over the family ledger by lamplight. "Great-great-grandfather saw a man trampled by horses," he said without looking up as Margaret entered. "He tried to warn him, even physically restrained him from crossing the street, but the man broke free, stepped into the road, and the horses came just as predicted." Margaret sat beside her son, gently closing the book. "You shouldn't be reading this, William. These accounts are meant for when you're older." "I'm trying to find the pattern," the boy explained, his eyes far too serious for a child of 10. There must be rules to how this works. Perhaps we're going about it all wrong. Margaret's heart ached for her youngest child. She had hoped the ability would skip his generation, sparing him this burden until adulthood, as it had with Thomas and Elizabeth. Neither of her older children had shown signs of the gift, though the family history suggested it might still manifest as they aged. Your father and I, we've spent our lives studying these visions, she told him softly, as did your grandmother and her father before her. If there were a way to change what's been foreseen, we would have discovered it by now. But what if, William began, only to suddenly stiffen in his chair, his eyes rolling back to show only whites, just like his grandmother's did during her episodes. The Harrington twins, he intoned, his voice hollow and distant. Halloween night, the old well in Widow's Field. They'll fall, both of them. The search will last 3 days before they're found. Then he slumped forward, and Margaret caught him before he could hit the desk. As his eyes fluttered open, returning to normal, confusion crossed his face. Was it another vision? He asked weakly. Margaret nodded, helping him sit upright. The Harrington twins, we'll do what we can, as we always do. Later that night, after William had been put to bed, the adults of the family convened in Elias's study. The room, with its wall of books, globe in the corner, and large oak desk, had been the site of many such discussions over the years. The boy is having too many visions, Agatha declared, settling into a leather armchair by the fire. Far more than I did at his age. It's consuming him. Perhaps we should consult Dr. Monroe, Margaret suggested, referring to the family physician who was among the few outsiders aware of their unusual ability. He might prescribe something to help William sleep at least. Medicine won't solve this, Thomas interjected. Having returned from Harvard for the weekend, he brought a fresh perspective influenced by his studies in philosophy and the emerging field of psychology. William needs to understand that this ability doesn't define him, that he can live a normal life despite it. Elias, who had been silently smoking his pipe by the window, finally spoke. There's nothing normal about our family, Thomas. The sooner William accepts that, the better equipped he'll be to bear this responsibility. Responsibility? Thomas scoffed. What responsibility? To witness suffering without being able to prevent it? To be branded madmen if we try to warn others? What purpose does this ability serve if not to change outcomes? Perhaps the purpose is not to change events, but to prepare for them, Elizabeth suggested quietly from where she sat in the corner, embroidery in hand. To help those affected afterward, to be present for the aftermath, knowing what comfort will be needed. The family fell silent, considering her words. It was a perspective they had discussed before, that perhaps their role was not prevention but consolation. Yet it provided little solace when confronted with tragedies like Timothy Lambert's death or the drowning of the fisherman. Regardless, Elias finally said, tapping his pipe on the ashtray, we must address the matter at hand. The Harrington twins, Robert and Richard, are classmates of William's. Halloween is but 2 weeks away. We must decide how to proceed. The family spent hours deliberating their approach. Direct intervention had failed countless times before. Warnings were ignored or, worse, remembered after the fact as evidence of the Caldwells' involvement. Over generations, they had learned discretion. Having once faced accusations of witchcraft from superstitious townsfolk, they ultimately decided on a multi-pronged strategy. Elias would speak with Mayor Harrington, the twins' father, about securing the old well in Widow's Field as a matter of public safety. Margaret would invite Mrs. Harrington to tea and casually suggest keeping the boys home on Halloween night due to reports of older boys planning mischief. Thomas would befriend the twins' older sister during his stay home from university, hoping to influence the family's plans indirectly. Each approach failed spectacularly. The mayor, preoccupied with an upcoming election, dismissed the well concern as low priority. Mrs. Harrington, proud of her boys' independence, insisted they were old enough for a supervised outing with friends. The twins' sister showed no interest in Thomas's attentions, being secretly engaged to a young man from the neighboring town. Halloween arrived crisp and clear, with a full moon illuminating the fallen leaves that carpeted Blackmere's streets. Children in homemade costumes, ghosts, goblins, and witches, roamed from house to house, collecting treats and playing pranks in the ancient tradition. The Caldwell family remained at home, a sense of dread permeating the house. William sat by his bedroom window, watching the revelry below with solemn eyes. When the grandfather clock in the hall struck 8, he turned to his mother, who had been sitting quietly nearby. "They're at the well now," he whispered. "I can feel it." Margaret took his hand, her heart heavy. "I know, dear. Your father is already on his way there with lanterns and rope. Perhaps this time—" But they both knew the truth. The family ledger contained not a single instance of a successfully averted fate in 7 generations. True to William's vision, the Harrington twins fell into the old well that night while playing a daring game with their friends. The rotted wooden cover, long forgotten and hidden beneath autumn leaves, gave way beneath their weight. The search lasted exactly 3 days before their bodies were recovered from the cold water 20 feet below. The town of Blackmere mourned the loss. The Caldwells attended the funeral, standing respectfully at the back of the crowded church. Mayor Harrington's face was ashen, his wife beside him nearly catatonic with grief. Watching them, William felt a crushing responsibility, despite his family's assurances that he was not to blame. "You merely witnessed what was to come," his father had told him. "You did not cause it." But such distinctions offered little comfort to a child who had seen death approach and been powerless to stop it. As November brought shorter days and longer nights, William withdrew further into himself. He spent hours in the family library, studying the ledger and any books that might shed light on their unusual ability. Medical texts, philosophical treatises, even arcane volumes on spiritualism and the occult. Nothing was beyond his desperate curiosity. His grandmother Agatha became his primary companion during these studies. Though stern with others, she showed a gentleness toward William, born of shared experience. "I was younger than you when my first major vision came," she told him one afternoon as they sat before the library fire. "I saw my best friend Sophia drowning in the pond behind her house. I tried everything, begging her not to go near water, accidentally breaking her ice skates, even feigning illness so she would stay to care for me. But on that winter day, her brother fell through the ice instead, and Sophia, trying to save him, was pulled under." William looked up from the book he'd been skimming. "Did you ever try to understand why? Why we can see but not change?" Agatha's weathered face softened. "For decades I questioned. I raged. I bargained with God. Eventually I came to believe that time is like a river. We can see downstream, around the bend, a rare gift indeed, but the current is too powerful to redirect. But rivers can be dammed," William countered with a child's simple logic. "Their courses can be changed by human hands." "Perhaps," Agatha conceded, with a sad smile, "but we have yet to discover how." As November progressed toward December, William's visions continued, though less frequently. The family addressed each one with their usual combination of subtle intervention and resigned acceptance. A kitchen fire at the Blackmere Hotel was foreseen. Their warning was ignored. 3 staff members suffered burns. A carriage accident on the Boston Road was predicted. Their attempt to delay the travelers failed. The driver lost an arm. Each incident was dutifully recorded in the ledger, alongside hundreds of similar accounts stretching back to the early 1700s, when Jeremiah Caldwell first documented his unusual affliction of prophetic sight. Meanwhile, William's initial vision about the flying machine and the church bell tower remained at the forefront of the family's concerns. As Christmas approached, they debated its meaning with increasing urgency. "Perhaps it's a metaphor," Elizabeth suggested during a family dinner in early December. "The flying machine could represent progress or innovation crashing into tradition, symbolized by the church. Or it could be literal," Thomas countered. "The Wright brothers have been experimenting with flying machines. I read about their glider tests in the scientific journals at Harvard. Perhaps someone will attempt to replicate their work." "Whatever its meaning," Elias said firmly, "we must be vigilant as Christmas approaches. I've already spoken with Reverend Phillips about examining the bell tower for structural weaknesses, using the recent storms as pretense." William, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke. "It's not the church in town," he said with certainty. "It's the old mission church in the woods, where the first settlers built before moving to the coast. The one with the broken bell." The family turned to him in surprise. The abandoned mission was seldom visited, situated 3 miles into the forest on what had once been the main road before the town relocated closer to the harbor generations ago. Its bell had cracked during a fire in the 1820s, producing a distinctive, discordant toll that could still be heard on particularly quiet nights when the wind blew from that direction. "How can you be so certain?" Margaret asked her son. William frowned, struggling to articulate what he knew instinctively. "In my vision, when the flying machine hits, the bell rings, but it sounds wrong, broken, and there are trees all around, not buildings." Elias nodded thoughtfully. I'll arrange for men to watch the old mission on Christmas Eve then, though what we'll tell them? The truth, Agatha said unexpectedly, or a version of it. Tell them William overheard travelers discussing a plan to test a flying contraption near the old church. It's plausible enough, with all the interest in the Wright brothers' experiments. The family agreed to this approach, though none held much hope for success. Their history suggested that whatever was coming would come regardless of their preparations. As December wore on, Blackmere transformed for the holiday season. Evergreen boughs adorned shop fronts, while candles and ribbon decorations brightened windows. The annual Christmas bazaar filled the town square with vendors selling handcrafted gifts, baked goods, and hot cider. Despite the festive atmosphere, the Caldwell family moved through these celebrations with an underlying tension, their thoughts never far from William's unexplained vision. Then, a week before Christmas, a stranger arrived in Blackmere. He came by train from Boston, carrying a large trunk and several unusual parcels wrapped in oilcloth. He took a room at the Blackmere Hotel and gave his name as Professor Ambrose Whitby of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His stated purpose was to study the coastal weather patterns, though he asked many questions about the surrounding geography, particularly the inland areas where the old mission stood. News of the stranger reached the Caldwell house through Elizabeth, who had encountered him at the post office. He was mailing letters to scientific colleagues, she reported over dinner. I glimpsed the addresses, one to MIT, another to someone at Cornell. He noticed my interest and introduced himself quite politely. When I mentioned our family name, he seemed to recognize it. Did he say anything about flying machines? William asked eagerly. Not directly, Elizabeth replied. But he did ask about high points in the area, hills, church steeples, that sort of thing. And he had ink stains on his fingers, like he'd been drawing technical diagrams. Elias frowned. I'll call on him tomorrow. Under the guise of welcoming him to town, I can perhaps discern his true intentions. The following morning, Elias visited Professor Whitby at the hotel. He returned 2 hours later, his expression troubled as he gathered the family in his study. Professor Whitby is indeed from MIT, he reported, though he's taken a leave of absence for a personal project. He was reluctant to share details, but when I pressed him, claiming concern as a town leader, he admitted to developing what he calls an ornithopter, a machine that mimics bird flight through mechanical wings. Margaret gasped softly. Like William's vision. Precisely, Elias confirmed. He plans to test it on Christmas Eve, claiming the winter air density is ideal. I tried to dissuade him, suggesting the coastal cliffs instead of the inland areas, but he was adamant about the old mission site. He said the clearing provides the perfect launching point, and the bell tower offers a visual marker for navigation. Did you warn him directly? Thomas asked. Elias shook his head. I considered it, but what could I say? That my 10-year-old son foresaw his machine crashing? He's a man of science. He'd dismiss such claims outright. Then we must stop him by other means, Margaret declared, her maternal instinct to protect overriding the family's usual caution. If this man dies because we failed to act decisively, we don't know that he dies, Elizabeth interrupted. William's vision showed the machine crashing into the bell tower, but said nothing of the pilot's fate. All eyes turned to William, who sat in the window seat, watching snowflakes begin to fall outside. I don't know if he lives or dies, the boy admitted quietly. I just saw the crash, the machine breaking apart, the bell ringing its broken song. Agatha, who had been silently observing the discussion, finally spoke. Perhaps this is our opportunity. In all our family's history, we've never encountered someone whose fate we foresaw before meeting them. Our attempts to warn others have always involved people already known to us, neighbors, friends, townsfolk. This professor is an outsider with no reason to dismiss our concerns out of hand. What are you suggesting, Mother? Margaret asked. That we tell him everything, Agatha replied simply. Our family history, our ability, William's vision. Perhaps an outsider, a man of science, might approach our situation with fresh eyes, might see a solution where we, too close to our burden, have missed one. The idea was radical. For generations, the Caldwells had guarded their secret closely, sharing it only with spouses who married into the family and, occasionally, trusted physicians. The persecution of their ancestors during the witch trial era had taught them the danger of public knowledge. After much debate, they reached a compromise. Thomas, with his Harvard education and articulate manner, would approach Professor Whitby alone. He would present the family history as an intellectual curiosity, a case study in prophetic phenomena, and gauge the professor's reaction before deciding whether to reveal William's specific vision about the ornithopter. 2 days before Christmas, Thomas invited Whitby to join him for dinner at the town's finest restaurant. Over oysters and lamb, he gradually steered the conversation toward matters of philosophy and science. "I'm curious, Professor," Thomas said casually, refilling the older man's wine glass. "What is your opinion on predestination? The notion that events are fixed, regardless of our choices." Whitby, a lean man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard, considered the question with obvious interest. "An age-old philosophical debate," he replied. "The ancient Greeks grappled with it, as did early Christian theologians. Modern science tends toward determinism, the belief that all events, including human decisions, are ultimately determined by previously existing causes rather than free will." "And where do you stand?" Thomas pressed. "I find myself caught between perspectives," Whitby admitted. "As a scientist, I understand that physical laws govern our universe in predictable ways. Yet as a human, I experience the sensation of choice, of agency." Sensing an opening, Thomas leaned forward. "What would you say if I told you my family has struggled with this question for generations due to an unusual ability?" "I'd say you have my full attention," Whitby responded, setting down his fork. Over the next hour, Thomas shared a carefully edited version of the Caldwell family history. He described their prophetic visions, their numerous attempts to change predicted outcomes, and their consistent failure to alter the course of events. He presented it as a documented phenomenon spanning 3 centuries, framing it in scientific terms rather than supernatural ones. To his surprise, Professor Whitby listened without skepticism, asking occasional clarifying questions that suggested genuine intellectual engagement rather than dismissal. "Fascinating," he said when Thomas concluded. "You've essentially described a practical test of determinism versus free will, repeated hundreds of times with consistent results. Have you considered publishing your family records anonymously in a scientific journal?" "The risk of identification is too great," Thomas explained. "Even anonymously, the details would make our family recognizable to those in Blackmere. And while witch trials may be behind us, the stigma of perceived madness or fraud remains potent." Whitby nodded thoughtfully. "A valid concern, but what a remarkable opportunity for study. If I might be permitted to examine these records, perhaps even interview family members who experience these visions." "Actually," Thomas interrupted, seizing the moment, "there is a more immediate matter. My youngest brother recently had a vision that may involve you." The professor's eyebrows rose. "Me? But I've only just arrived in Blackmere." "Precisely what makes this situation unique," Thomas explained. "He saw this vision before your arrival, involving a man with a flying machine crashing into the bell tower of the old mission church on Christmas Eve." Whitby's face paled visibly. "That's remarkably specific and accurate regarding my plans, which I shared with no one before arriving." "Then you understand our concern," Thomas pressed. "Every prediction in our family history has come to pass, despite all efforts to prevent it. We fear for your safety, Professor." The scientist removed his spectacles, cleaning them thoughtfully with his napkin. "You realize how this sounds to someone of my background. Prophetic visions, inescapable fate. It contradicts everything modern science stands for." "I understand completely," Thomas assured him. "I'd react the same way in your position. That's why I'm not asking you to believe us outright. I'm simply asking you to consider postponing your test flight as a precaution, or choosing a different location." "And if I do?" Whitby challenged. "If I change my plans entirely, test my ornithopter next summer in a completely different state, what does your family theory predict? That something would still draw you to that bell tower on Christmas Eve?" Thomas replied grimly. "A sudden change of heart, a mechanical problem requiring shelter, a storm forcing you inland. We've seen it countless times. The specific circumstances shift, but the predicted outcome remains constant." Professor Whitby replaced his spectacles, his scientific curiosity evidently piqued. "Then we have before us a perfect experimental opportunity. I shall make every effort to avoid the old mission on Christmas Eve. If your family predictions hold true, it would be evidence worth considering. If not, perhaps your family's belief in the immutability of foreseen events might be challenged." Thomas returned home that night cautiously optimistic. He reported to the family that Whitby had agreed to cancel his Christmas Eve test flight and would instead join them for Christmas dinner, after which he hoped to interview Agatha and William about their experiences. "He's humoring us," Elias said skeptically. He likely thinks we're an eccentric family indulging in superstition. Perhaps, Thomas conceded, but he seemed genuinely intrigued from a scientific perspective, and most importantly, he's agreed not to go near the old mission. William, listening from his usual window seat, shook his head slowly. It won't matter, he said softly. He'll be there. The machine will crash. The bell will ring. The days before Christmas passed in a flurry of activity. The town held its annual carol service. Shopkeepers worked late to fulfill last-minute orders, and children grew increasingly excited as the holiday approached. A heavy snow fell on December 23rd, blanketing Blackmere in white and promising a picturesque Christmas. At the Caldwell house, preparations for their Christmas dinner continued, alongside more covert arrangements. Elias hired 3 trusted men to watch the old mission church on Christmas Eve, with instructions to intercept Professor Whitby should he appear. Thomas maintained daily contact with the professor, reinforcing their dinner invitation and subtly checking that he remained committed to avoiding the mission site. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the family gathered for breakfast, an undercurrent of tension beneath their holiday spirits. William had been unusually quiet, picking at his food rather than eating. "Are you feeling unwell, dear?" Margaret asked, placing a hand on his forehead to check for fever. William shook his head. "I had another vision last night," he said quietly, "about Professor Whitby." The table fell silent, all attention turning to the boy. "What did you see?" Elias asked gently. "It was clearer this time," William explained. "The professor is running through the snow toward the old mission. He looks scared. He keeps looking back over his shoulder like someone's chasing him. Then he's climbing the bell tower stairs. The flying machine is already there. He's trying to move it. That's when it falls, crashes through the floor, and hits the bell." Thomas frowned. "But that contradicts your earlier vision. You said he would be flying the machine when it crashed." "I didn't see him flying," William clarified. "I just saw the machine crash. I assumed he'd be operating it." Agatha fixed her grandson with an intense gaze. "Is there anything else, William? Any detail you might have missed?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "There was someone else there. I couldn't see who. Just a shadow at the edge of my vision. But I felt danger." This new information changed their calculations entirely. If William's vision now showed Whitby running from someone, possibly in danger, their focus needed to shift from preventing his presence at the mission to ensuring his safety. Elias immediately dispatched a messenger to the men watching the mission, updating their instructions. Thomas set out for the Blackmere Hotel to check on the professor personally, while Margaret and Elizabeth prepared the house for their Christmas Eve gathering, trying to maintain normalcy despite their concerns. When Thomas returned an hour later, his expression was grim. "Professor Whitby isn't at the hotel," he reported to his father in the privacy of the study. "His room is undisturbed, bed made, curtains open, but there's no sign of him. The clerk said he went out early this morning with his sketchbook, mentioning something about capturing the town in the snow." "Could he have gone to the mission already?" Elias wondered, pouring himself a small brandy despite the early hour. "It's possible, but why? He seemed genuinely committed to our experiment yesterday. Unless," Thomas paused, a troubling thought occurring to him, "unless he decided to test both possibilities simultaneously, to visit the mission and see if the predicted crash would occur, while also planning to join us for dinner to observe our reactions when it didn't. A scientist to the end," Elias murmured, testing all variables. The day progressed with mounting tension. By mid-afternoon, there was still no sign of Professor Whitby in town. The men watching the old mission reported no activity there. The family gathered in the drawing room, ostensibly for holiday refreshments, but actually to discuss their next steps. "I should go to the mission myself," Thomas volunteered. "If William's vision is correct, the professor may already be in danger." "Not alone," Elias insisted. "I'll accompany you. The snow is deep in the forest, and darkness comes early this time of year." As the men prepared to depart, bundling into heavy coats and gathering lanterns, a commotion at the front door interrupted them. Their butler entered the drawing room, his usually composed demeanor unsettled. "Mr. Caldwell, there are police officers here to see you," he announced. "They're asking about Professor Whitby." 2 officers from the Blackmere police force entered behind him, Chief Warren and Sergeant Miller. Both men had known the Caldwell family for years, but their expressions were professionally neutral as they removed their hats. "Mr. Caldwell," Chief Warren began, "we understand your son Thomas was one of the last people to speak with Professor Ambrose Whitby. Is that correct?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed, stepping forward. I had dinner with him 2 nights ago and spoke with him briefly yesterday. Is something wrong? The officers exchanged glances before the chief continued. The professor's colleagues at MIT telegraphed us this morning. Apparently, he sent them a letter from Blackmere mentioning a remarkable family with prophetic abilities. He indicated he would be testing their predictions on Christmas Eve and would report his findings afterward. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather spread through the room. The family had spent generations carefully guarding their secret, and now it appeared to be unraveling. We haven't seen Professor Whitby today, Elias stated calmly. We expected him for dinner this evening. If he's missing, we're as concerned as you are. Chief Warren's expression remained skeptical. His belongings are still at the hotel, but there's something else. The innkeeper reports that Whitby was constructing some sort of contraption in his room. She described it as mechanical wings. Now both he and this device are missing. He told me about his invention, Thomas offered. An ornithopter, he called it. He's an aviation enthusiast, studying the Wright brothers' work. We're organizing a search, Sergeant Miller interjected. Given the snow and the temperature, if he's lost in the woods, time is critical. We'd appreciate any information on where he might have gone. The Caldwells faced a difficult choice. Revealing William's vision would expose their family secret to official scrutiny, potentially bringing unwanted attention. Yet withholding information might endanger the professor's life. Elias made the decision. We have reason to believe he may have gone to the old mission church. In fact, we were just preparing to check there ourselves. The chief raised an eyebrow. What makes you think that? Before Elias could formulate a plausible explanation, William stepped forward from where he'd been sitting quietly beside his grandmother. Because I saw him there in a vision, the boy said clearly. He's in danger. The room fell silent. The officers stared at William, then at Elias, clearly unsure how to respond to a child's apparent confirmation of the professor's bizarre claims. William has certain intuitions, Margaret explained hastily. We've learned to trust them. Please, if you're organizing a search party, the old mission should be your first priority. Whether from respect for the Caldwell family or from the urgency of the situation, Chief Warren nodded curtly. We'll include it in our search. Mr. Caldwell, perhaps you and your son would join us, since you're familiar with the professor. Within the hour, a search party had assembled in the town square. Police officers, local volunteers, and the Caldwell men. They split into groups, with Elias, Thomas, and 4 officers heading toward the old mission while others searched the town and shoreline. As they trudged through the snow-covered forest, daylight fading rapidly despite being only mid-afternoon, Thomas found himself walking beside Chief Warren. Your brother's intuition, the chief said quietly, enough distance between them and the others to ensure privacy. It's not the first time your family has had such insights, is it? Thomas hesitated, then decided on honesty. No, it's a family trait, going back generations. I remember my grandfather speaking of your great-grandfather, Warren continued, said he warned the town about the Mill Pond flood of 1862 weeks before it happened, called him touched by God. Others had less charitable interpretations. We've learned to be discreet, Thomas replied carefully. The chief nodded. Wise. People fear what they don't understand. After a moment he added, if the boy says the professor's at the mission, I'm inclined to give it serious consideration. They reached the clearing where the old mission stood just as the winter sun began to set. The stone building, weathered by nearly 2 centuries of New England seasons, stood in stark contrast to the white snow surrounding it. Its wooden bell tower, a later addition from the 1800s, rose from the center of the roof, casting a long shadow across the clearing. At first glance, the scene appeared undisturbed. No footprints in the snow, no signs of activity. The men Elias had hired to watch the place approached from their hidden position among the trees. No one's come or gone all day, Mr. Caldwell, one reported. Place is quiet as a grave. Chief Warren frowned. You had men watching this place already? You were that convinced the professor would come here? Before Elias could respond, a faint sound carried through the cold air, a voice calling for help from inside the mission. The search party rushed forward, forcing open the ancient wooden doors that had swollen with moisture. Inside, the single room was dark, illuminated only by what little daylight filtered through small, grimy windows. Dust covered the few remaining pews, and years of neglect had left the floor littered with debris. Up here! Help! The voice came from above, in the bell tower. Thomas was the first to find the narrow staircase leading up to the tower. He ascended quickly, followed by Chief Warren and Sergeant Miller. while Elias directed the others to secure the building's perimeter. In the bell tower, they found Professor Whitby, his clothing torn and bloodied, a crude bandage wrapped around his left leg. Beside him lay the broken remains of his ornithopter, wooden struts and canvas wings shattered beyond repair. "Thomas," the professor gasped, relief flooding his features. "Thank God. He's gone, I think, but he might return." "Who's gone?" Chief Warren demanded, kneeling beside the injured man. "What happened here?" "Thatcher," Whitby managed, wincing as the sergeant examined his wounded leg. "Edmund Thatcher from the university, my former assistant. He followed me here, stole my research months ago and claimed it as his own. When he learned I was developing a working prototype, the story emerged in fragments as they carefully moved the professor down the treacherous stairs." Whitby had indeed decided to test the Caldwell prediction by visiting the mission that morning, bringing his ornithopter not to fly it but to prove he could be there without incident. Instead, he'd encountered Thatcher, who had apparently tracked him to Blackmere, intent on eliminating both his former mentor and the evidence of his plagiarism. "He attacked me in the tower," Whitby explained as they settled him on a pew. "We struggled. The ornithopter fell against the bell mount. I managed to fight him off. He fled when I shouted that others were coming, but the damage was done." Thomas glanced up at the cracked bell, now hanging at an even more precarious angle than before. William's vision had been accurate yet again. The flying machine had crashed into the bell tower, and the broken bell had rung. But the circumstances were entirely different from what they had anticipated. As the search party prepared to transport the injured professor back to town, Chief Warren organized a smaller group to pursue Thatcher, who had left clear tracks in the fresh snow. Night had fallen completely by the time they returned to Blackmere, bringing Professor Whitby directly to Dr. Monroe's home for treatment. Word of the dramatic rescue spread quickly through the town, though the Caldwells were careful to downplay William's role in directing the search. The family's Christmas Eve gathering proceeded as planned, though with subdued spirits. Margaret and Elizabeth made sure the festivities continued for William's sake, but the adults exchanged knowing glances throughout the evening. Once again, they had witnessed the immutability of foreseen events, despite their best efforts. Late that night, after guests had departed and the younger children were asleep, Thomas found his father in the study, updating the family ledger by lamplight. "Another entry for the record," Elias said without looking up, "though this one has more complexities than most." Thomas poured 2 glasses of brandy, offering one to his father. "The professor wants to speak with us tomorrow. He's quite insistent despite his condition. No doubt he has questions," Elias replied, accepting the drink. "As do the police. Chief Warren has been discreet so far, but explanations will be expected. Perhaps it's time," Thomas suggested carefully. "Not for public knowledge, but for a more scientific understanding of our family's ability. Professor Whitby is a man of reason. His perspective might offer insights our family has lacked." Elias considered this, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "For generations we've guarded this secret, believing protection lay in silence. Yet in all that time we've made no progress in understanding or controlling these visions. Perhaps a fresh perspective is warranted." The following day, Christmas, brought news that Edmund Thatcher had been apprehended attempting to board a train to New York. The evidence against him was substantial, including notes found in his possession detailing his plans to sabotage Whitby's work and eliminate his former mentor. In the afternoon, as promised, the family visited Professor Whitby at Dr. Monroe's home. Despite his injured leg and general weakness, the scientist was alert and eager to speak with them, particularly William. "Young man," he said warmly as the boy approached his bedside, "you have my profound gratitude. Your warning, however impossible it seemed, saved my life." William looked puzzled, "But we couldn't change anything. The machine still crashed into the bell tower just as I saw." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken," Whitby replied, his academic enthusiasm overriding his physical discomfort. "Your vision was accurate, yes, but your interpretation, our interpretation, was flawed. You saw the outcome, but not the complete circumstances. And that, I believe, may be the key to understanding your family's unique ability." Over the next hour, Whitby outlined a theory that left the family stunned. He proposed that the Caldwells' visions were indeed glimpses of immutable future events, fixed points in time that would occur regardless of intervention. However, he suggested that their interpretation of these visions, limited by human perspective, often missed crucial context. "Consider this case," he explained. "William saw my ornithopter crash into the bell tower. We all assumed this meant I would be flying it, that the crash would be an accident. None of us anticipated a third party, a struggle, or that the machine would never even leave the ground. Are you suggesting our attempts to change the future fail because we misunderstand what we're seeing? Thomas asked, intrigued by the scientific framing. Precisely, Whitby confirmed. You're trying to prevent specific events without full context. It's like seeing a photograph of a man falling without knowing whether he jumped, was pushed, or simply slipped. The outcome, the fall, is fixed, but the circumstances leading to it may have countless variations. Margaret leaned forward, hope kindling in her eyes for the first time in years. If this is true, how does it help us? Are we still powerless to change what's foreseen? Perhaps, Whitby admitted, but understanding the limitation of your visions might allow you to work within them rather than against them. Instead of futile attempts to prevent the inevitable, you might focus on influencing the circumstances surrounding it, minimizing harm, preparing for aftermath, positioning yourselves to help. Agatha, who had been silently observing, nodded slowly. Elizabeth suggested something similar, that our purpose might be preparation rather than prevention. Your daughter shows insight, Whitby commended. Consider my case again. The ornithopter crashed as predicted, but because of your warning, I was being watched for. The search party was organized quickly. My injury was treated promptly. Thatcher was captured before he could escape. The outcome occurred, but the consequences were managed. For the first time in 7 generations, the Caldwell family faced the possibility that their ability, while still a burden, might not be the cruel joke they had considered it. If they couldn't change what was foreseen, perhaps they could still change what followed. In the days after Christmas, as Professor Whitby recovered, he worked closely with the family, particularly Thomas and William. Together they began developing a new methodology for recording and interpreting visions, noting not just the predicted events but possible variations in context, focusing on preparation rather than prevention. Whitby, true to his scientific nature, proposed an experiment. When William next had a significant vision, they would document multiple possible interpretations, prepare for various scenarios, and focus on mitigating consequences rather than preventing the core event. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On New Year's Eve, William experienced a vision of the town's ice house collapsing, seeing stored ice blocks crushing wooden beams and walls splintering outward. Instead of simply warning the ice house owner, which had failed countless times before with similar predictions, the family applied their new approach. They considered multiple scenarios: structural failure, deliberate sabotage, excessive weight from new ice, or external damage from a collision. They couldn't prevent the collapse, that was the fixed point, but they could influence when and how it happened. Elias, using his authority as a prominent businessman, organized an inspection of the ice house, finding it dangerously overfilled. He arranged for a controlled partial dismantling and rebuilding, timing it during hours when workers would be absent. The ice house still collapsed during the process. The vision fulfilled, but no one was injured. The valuable ice was saved, and the owner's livelihood preserved. For the first time, the Caldwells had worked with fate rather than against it, achieving a measure of control they had never thought possible. Professor Whitby, though eventually returning to his position at MIT, maintained correspondence with the family for years afterward. He never published their story directly, respecting their privacy, but his papers on determinism and human agency contained thinly veiled references to their case. The Caldwell family continued to experience visions through the generations that followed. Their leather-bound ledger, now maintained by William as he grew into adulthood, took on a different character. Where once it had documented futile attempts to fight destiny, it now recorded successful interventions within the framework of inevitable events. They still couldn't change what was foreseen. The river of time, as Agatha had described it, was indeed too powerful to redirect. But they had learned to navigate its currents, to prepare for the rapids ahead, and to help others weather the journey. In Blackmere, the Caldwells became known not as prophets of doom, but as a family with uncanny foresight and practical compassion. When disaster struck, as it inevitably did in a coastal New England town, they were often mysteriously prepared, arriving with exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed. The burden of foreknowledge remained heavy, but it was no longer crushing. Through scientific inquiry and generational wisdom, they had transformed their family curse into something approaching a gift, not the gift of changing fate, but of facing it with understanding and purpose. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, As gas lamps yielded to electric lights and horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, the Caldwell family's story became a testament to human adaptability in the face of the inexplicable. They couldn't change what was written in the stars, but they had learned to read between the lines, finding, in that narrow margin, room enough for hope. And in the leather-bound ledger, beneath the final entry of 1899, William added a quote from Professor Whitby that would guide future generations of Caldwells. Fate may determine the river's course, but human ingenuity determines how we navigate its waters.